Hey guys, welcome to Still Night Stories, the channel where history whispers and dreams begin. If you're new here, or if you've been with us before, settle in. We're about to explore tales from the past designed to gently guide you into a state of calm. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It truly helps Still Night Stories reach more people seeking a peaceful escape. Tonight we're stepping back in time to ancient Rome, to a period so peculiar you might just think I'm making it up. Imagine, if you will, the bustling forum, usually alive with the chatter of merchants, the debates of senators, and the general cacophony of a vibrant metropolis. But now, picture it, quieter. A little too quiet. The street performers are still there, perhaps, but their jokes land with a thud, met only by nervous glances. You see a gladiator, fresh from the arena, trying to tell a funny story to a friend, but his voice drops to a whisper and his hand instinctively covers his mouth when a patrol of stern-faced guards walks by. You're trying to enjoy a quiet meal at a local taberna, and the wine is certainly flowing, but the usual boisterous laughter that echoes from such establishments is conspicuously absent. Instead, there's a low hum of hushed conversations, a sort of collective holding of breath, as if everyone is waiting for the other sandal to drop. This isn't just any ordinary day in Rome, it's a day under the shadow of an emperor who decided that mirth itself was a problem. You probably won't survive this level of subdued historical narration without drifting off. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins not with a booming decree, but with the subtle shaping of a mind. Our unsmiling protagonist, let's call him Emperor Solemnus, though that wasn't his real name, because of course it wasn't. Historical figures rarely choose such on-the-nose monikers for themselves. We're talking about a Roman emperor, a man who, like many of his predecessors, ascended to power amidst a complex web of familial expectation, political maneuvering, and, let's be honest, more than a little luck. His early life wasn't particularly remarkable for a member of the Roman elite. You'd find him studying rhetoric, practicing his oratory skills in the forum, perhaps indulging in the occasional chariot race, though always with a certain seriousness. He wasn't the kind of kid who'd be found pulling pranks or giggling uncontrollably at a fallen toga. No, even as a young man, there was an air of reserved dignity about him, a quiet intensity that distinguished him from his more boisterous peers. Imagine him at a symposium, while others are swapping witty remarks and raucous anecdotes, he's the one meticulously dissecting a philosophical text, perhaps frowning slightly at the very idea of a punchline. This wasn't necessarily a bad trait for a future leader. After all, stability and gravitas were highly prized in Roman society. You could even say he was born with a natural disposition for leadership, if leadership meant a perpetual state of quiet contemplation. His rise to power, however, was less a slow, deliberate climb and more a series of unexpected twists. Historians still argue whether his family's influence or a series of fortunate, if somewhat grim, circumstances truly paved his way to the purple. Perhaps a timely illness for a more charismatic rival, or a strategic alliance forged in the shadows of the Senate. Whatever the precise mechanism, you find him, almost surprisingly, elevated to the pinnacle of Roman authority. One day you're practicing your speeches, the next you're being hailed as Augustus, the weight of an empire suddenly resting on your relatively unburdened shoulders. It's enough to make anyone a little solemn, perhaps. You stand there, draped in your imperial toga, the cheers of the crowd a distant roar, and you realize the sheer magnitude of the task ahead. No time for jokes now, surely. The empire faces real problems: barbarian incursions on the borders, economic instability, and a population that sometimes seems more interested in bread and circuses than civic duty. It's a heavy burden, and our emperor, with his already serious disposition, felt it keenly. His early days on the throne were marked not by lavish feasts or triumphal parades, but by long hours spent poring over scrolls, consulting with advisors, and, one suspects, barely cracking a smile. This wasn't just a personal quirk, it began to seep into his governance. Upon taking the reins, Emperor Solemnus immediately embarked on what he saw as essential reforms. He wasn't interested in pomp or popularity contests, his focus was squarely on what he perceived as the moral decay of Roman society. You see him, poring over ledgers, scrutinizing budgets, and frankly, probably tutoring a lot. His initial policies were rooted in a deep-seated desire for austerity. Lavish banquets were curtailed, public spectacles deemed too extravagant were scaled back, and even the attire of citizens came under his watchful, unsmiling eye. He truly believed that the empire's strength lay not in its opulence, but in the discipline and virtue of its people. This meant cracking down on what he considered frivolous expenditures and encouraging a more frugal, no-nonsense way of life. Imagine trying to explain your new silk toga purchase to an emperor who believes everyone should be dressed in sensible wool. Good luck with that. He started with the easy targets: public debt, inefficient bureaucracy, and rampant corruption. These were things any sensible ruler would tackle, and you might even applaud his dedication. He appointed stern, humorless officials who mirrored his own disposition, dispatching them to various provinces to ensure his new, austere mandates were being followed. You'd see them, these prefects of prudence, marching through markets, scrutinizing transactions, and probably raising an eyebrow at any merchant caught haggling with too much enthusiasm. This wasn't about being mean-spirited, it was about bringing Rome back to what he considered its moral bedrock. He genuinely believed that a disciplined populace would be a strong populace, capable of facing down any challenge, internal or external. It was all very logical, very sensible, and very, very serious. One mainstream historical fact about Roman emperors is that many, at various points, attempted to reform public morals, often with mixed success, as cultural habits are notoriously difficult to legislate away. But then, something subtle, almost imperceptible at first, began to shift. The emperor's focus on serious matters started to extend beyond just economics and governance. He began to equate lightheartedness with weakness, laughter with a lack of gravitas. You can imagine him walking through the imperial gardens, observing his courtiers. Perhaps he saw a group sharing a hearty chuckle over some triviality, and a frown deepened on his face. Why are they laughing? He might have mused. Don't they understand the burdens of empire? The barbarians at the gates? The crumbling infrastructure? It began as a personal aversion, a discomfort with what he perceived as unseemly frivolity. He associated levity with idleness, and idleness, in his view, led to vice. So, the subtle pressure began: a cold stare for a joke told too loudly, a quick dismissal for a senator who dared to open a meeting with a light-hearted anecdote. This was the quiet genesis of his grand, peculiar idea. It wasn't an overnight decision, but a slow, creeping realization in his mind that laughter itself was a symptom of the very moral decay he sought to eradicate. An obscure tidbit from this period, though perhaps apocryphal, suggests he once dismissed a particularly skilled mime from a public festival simply because the mime's performance elicited too much uncontrolled mirth from the crowd. The emperor, so the story goes, saw it as a sign of intellectual laziness, a distraction from serious thought. You can almost hear the crickets chirping as the mime packed up his props. Historians still argue whether this growing aversion to laughter was a genuine philosophical conviction or a manifestation of a deeper psychological unease. Was he truly a stoic Puritan, or simply a man burdened by the weight of his office, losing touch with the lighter side of human nature? Whatever the cause, the social atmosphere in Rome, once vibrant and bustling, began to reflect the emperor's increasingly somber disposition. The ripple effect was noticeable. People started to self-censor, to modulate their expressions, to hold their mirth in check. The city, which had once echoed with the sounds of daily life, including the frequent bursts of spontaneous joy, slowly began to lower its volume, as if collectively holding its breath. It was as if a perpetual gray cloud had settled over the city, even on the sunniest of days. You could feel it in the air, a certain tension, a quiet apprehension, like waiting for a shoe to drop, or perhaps, a joke to bomb spectacularly. As Emperor Solemnus's quiet discomfort with public displays of joy intensified, it began to manifest in increasingly overt ways. You see him, perhaps at a public address, noticing a slight ripple of amusement pass through the crowd at a clumsy attendant, and his brow furrows. His internal monologue, if we could hear it, might have sounded something like this: "This isn't serious. This isn't what an empire on the brink needs. Laughter is a distraction, a weakness, a slippery slope to chaos." He started to actively discourage it, not just by example, but through veiled suggestions to his inner circle. You'd hear whispers among the palace staff: "The emperor prefers quiet contemplation," or "best to keep your jests to yourself when he's near." It was a subtle chilling effect, like a persistent draft in a grand hall, making everyone pull their cloaks a little tighter. The emperor's advisors, keen to stay in his good graces, quickly picked up on his unspoken desires. They, in turn, began to enforce this new, unwritten rule. Imagine a senator trying to tell a witty anecdote during a council meeting, only to be met with stony silence and disapproving glares from his colleagues, who are all meticulously studying their scrolls. The air thickens with unspoken disapproval. This period was less about outright suppression and more about a pervasive atmosphere of solemnity. Public festivals, while not entirely banned, lost their effervescent spontaneity. The jugglers still juggled, the musicians still played, but the boisterous crowds were replaced by more subdued gatherings, applause measured, smiles kept politely brief. It was as if Rome had collectively decided to attend a very serious lecture. One mainstream historical fact about Roman society is its strong emphasis on gravitas, a sense of dignity, seriousness, and profound importance. Emperor Solemnus likely saw himself as upholding and elevating this core Roman virtue. He believed he was restoring a lost sense of purpose and order. He wasn't simply being a spoilsport; in his mind, he was guiding Rome back to its purer, more disciplined roots. This was Rome as a vast, efficient machine, running on the oil of serious endeavor, with no room for the squeaky wheel of amusement. However, an obscure tidbit suggests that even within his own family, there was quiet resistance. His younger sister, known for her vibrant personality and love of theatrical performances, supposedly tried to subtly introduce him to comedies. She would read aloud from plays by Plautus, trying to elicit a chuckle, or at least a faint smirk. The emperor, it said, would listen patiently, then offer a meticulous critique of the play's structural flaws or its historical inaccuracies, entirely missing the humor. You can almost see her sighing, perhaps even rolling her eyes when his back was turned. It must have been truly exhausting trying to coax a laugh out of him. Historians still argue whether this escalating seriousness was a sign of his growing paranoia or a genuine, if misguided, attempt to unify the empire under a single, austere moral code. Was he trying to consolidate power by stripping away the very joy that might foster dissent, or did he truly believe that a society that laughs too much is a society that doesn't take itself seriously enough? Whatever his true motivation, the ground was being meticulously prepared for a decree that would forever etch his name into the annals of peculiar Roman emperors. The constant, gentle pressure, the pervasive atmosphere of quiet, the slow draining of spontaneous joy from public life, all of it was leading to one inevitable, humorless conclusion. The stage was set, not for a grand comedy, but for a very peculiar tragedy of mirth. You could feel the tension building, like a bad joke waiting for a punchline that never arrived. The air in Rome grew thicker with the emperor's somber disposition, and what began as a preference soon hardened into an official policy. Imagine the scene: a hushed meeting of the imperial council, typically a place of lively debate, now a room where every cough is stifled, every rustle of parchment sounds like thunder. Emperor Solemnus, seated on his throne, his face a mask of resolute seriousness, addresses his trembling advisors. You can almost feel the collective gulp in the room. He declares, not with a roar of anger, but with the quiet conviction of a man who believes he is doing what is right, that the empire's future depends on eliminating what he now sees as a most insidious vice, laughter. Yes, you heard that right. Not treason, not corruption, but the very act of amusement. The decree, when it was finally formalized, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic solemnity. It wasn't a flamboyant ban, but a meticulously worded edict, framed in the language of public welfare and moral upliftment. It spoke of the need for sobriety, for dignity in all public and private interactions, and gently, almost euphemistically, implied that excessive or uncontrolled mirth was disruptive to the harmonious functioning of society. It was, in essence, a ban on joy, disguised as a civic improvement initiative. You can picture the scribes, diligently copying this absurd legislation, perhaps with a nervous twitch in their quill hands, wondering if a stray chuckle would earn them a trip to the carcer. One mainstream historical fact about Roman law is its incredible detail and scope, often encompassing aspects of daily life that modern societies would consider personal. This emperor, in his desire for total control, simply pushed those boundaries further than perhaps any before him. He likely saw it as an extension of Roman civic duty, a logical step in creating the perfectly ordered society he envisioned. The edict didn't just target outright guffaws, it aimed at smiles that lingered too long, jokes that landed too well, and even the infectious giggles of children. The rationale, as explained by his loyal, unsmiling prefects, was that laughter undermined gravitas, eroded discipline, and distracted citizens from their duties. Imagine trying to explain to a group of bewildered Roman parents why their child's innocent giggle at a passing dog was now potentially a civic transgression. It's like trying to make a stoic philosopher out of a ticklish baby. An obscure tidbit from the period tells of a philosopher who, upon hearing the news, reportedly locked himself in his study for 3 days, attempting to determine if it was still permissible to smile internally. He apparently emerged looking even more confused than when he went in. This illustrates the sheer absurdity of trying to legislate a natural human emotion. You might find yourself wondering, if you lived in this Rome, how you'd manage to convey polite agreement without accidentally letting slip a hint of amusement. The social etiquette must have become a minefield of emotional suppression. Historians still argue whether the ban was primarily a reflection of the emperor's personal psychological state, perhaps a profound melancholia or an obsessive need for control, or if it was a calculated political move to subdue a populace he saw as too prone to dissent when happy. Was he a genuinely troubled soul, or just a very, very strict manager? Whatever the underlying cause, the edict against excessive mirth, as it was informally known, cast a long, somber shadow over the entire empire. You could practically hear the collective sigh, quickly suppressed, across the Roman world. The once vibrant soundscape of the city was now replaced by a hushed quiet, punctuated only by necessary conversation and the ever-present, humorless footsteps of the imperial guard. With the edict against excessive mirth now a formal, albeit ludicrous, law, the Roman Empire entered an era of enforced solemnity. You can almost feel the stifling atmosphere as the imperial pronouncements were nailed to public forums, read aloud by grim-faced heralds. But how exactly do you enforce a ban on laughter? It's not like you can arrest someone for thinking a funny thought. The practicalities, as you might imagine, quickly descended into the absurd. Initially, the enforcement was handled by a newly appointed corps of Decorum Monitors. Imagine a legion of perpetually unamused individuals, clad in drab tunics, patrolling public spaces. Their job wasn't to chase down criminals, but to observe. You'd see them lurking near the marketplaces, their eyes scanning for any telltale twitch of a lip, any glimmer of amusement in someone's gaze. A merchant, haggling too jovially, might find a stern monitor suddenly at his elbow, clearing his throat pointedly. A group of children playing too boisterously in the street would be met with a disapproving glare, perhaps even a quiet, stern word to their parents about civic duty and the importance of decorum. It was all very subtle, very passive-aggressive, and utterly effective in squelching spontaneity. One mainstream historical fact about Roman policing is that it varied greatly by period and region, but typically focused on maintaining order, preventing riots, and dealing with serious crimes. This emperor, however, diverted resources to an entirely new, deeply psychological form of social control. It was less about physical enforcement and more about cultivating a pervasive sense of self-censorship. The absurdities quickly piled up. There's an obscure tidbit about a public orator who, during a particularly dry speech, accidentally mispronounced a key word, resulting in a ripple of hushed chuckles. The Decorum Monitor present immediately made a note on his tablet, and the orator found himself scheduled for mandatory re-education sessions on appropriate public speaking. It wasn't about the mispronunciation, it was about the response it elicited. Imagine being so afraid of laughter that you start to view public speaking errors as a form of comedic rebellion. You can picture the citizens trying to navigate this new landscape. Social gatherings became tense affairs. Dinners, once occasions for convivial storytelling and wine-fueled merriment, turned into quiet, almost reverent meals, where conversations were kept to safe, serious topics like crop yields or the latest military campaigns. Jokes became a dangerous game, passed in whispers, if at all, and always with a nervous glance over the shoulder. You might try to suppress a smile, only to find your facial muscles cramping from the effort. It was like living in a perpetual state of holding your breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, or perhaps, for a particularly bad pun to land you in hot water. Historians still argue whether the emperor genuinely believed this policy would create a more virtuous society, or if he was simply projecting his own profound inability to experience joy onto his entire empire. Was he a deluded idealist, or simply a deeply unhappy man who couldn't stand the sight of others being lighthearted? Whatever the answer, the enforcement of the laughter ban created a society where genuine emotion was stifled, replaced by a veneer of forced solemnity. The city, once alive with the vibrant tapestry of human sound, began to sound like a library during finals week, a monument to enforced silence and the peculiar lengths to which a ruler might go to achieve his vision of order. Despite the emperor's best efforts to drain all joy from Rome, human nature, being what it is, found ways to resist. You can't simply legislate away a smile, even with the most humorless decorum monitors on patrol. The whispers began, quiet at first, then growing into a subtle hum of shared understanding. People found solace in small acts of rebellion, tiny pockets of mirth that blossomed in unexpected places. Imagine a group of ordinary Roman citizens, perhaps at the baths, where surveillance was harder to maintain. A fleeting, almost imperceptible glance shared between two bathers, a conspiratorial raising of an eyebrow when a particularly clumsy attendant slips. It was enough. These were the whispers of dissent, not loud protests, but quiet, humorous acts of defiance that kept the spirit of laughter alive. One mainstream historical fact is that throughout history, oppressive regimes have often faced covert resistance, particularly when they attempt to control aspects of daily life and personal expression. This Roman era was no different. The human spirit, it seems, has an inherent need for levity, even under duress. These acts often took the form of subtle, knowing glances, or a quickly stifled cough that was actually a suppressed chuckle. There's an obscure tidbit about a group of street performers who adapted their acts. Instead of overtly comedic routines, they would perform seemingly serious pantomimes that, through a precise gesture or an exaggerated facial expression, conveyed a hidden, ironic commentary on the solemnity of the age. The audience, understanding the subtext, would respond not with laughter, but with a collective, silent nod, a shared understanding that was its own form of humorous defiance. It was a communication of amusement without the forbidden sound, a silent conspiracy of joy. You might find yourself observing such a performance, a wry smile playing on your lips, quickly hidden behind a cupped hand. Imagine a private dinner party, the windows carefully shuttered against prying eyes. A host might offer a joke, but instead of a guffaw, guests would respond with a silent nod, perhaps a quick, almost imperceptible widening of the eyes, acknowledging the humor without making a sound. It was like a silent comedy club, where the punchlines landed directly in your mind. This collective understanding, this shared secret, fostered a unique bond among those who dared to find amusement in a humorless world. It was a quiet act of courage, a gentle middle finger to the emperor's rigid decree. Historians still argue whether these small, everyday acts of defiance were truly effective in undermining the emperor's authority, or if they merely served as a psychological pressure valve for a frustrated populace. Did these whispers of dissent eventually contribute to a broader shift in policy, or were they simply harmless expressions of human nature that the emperor, in his relentless pursuit of grim order, simply failed to fully suppress? Whatever their impact, these silent jokes and knowing glances provided a much-needed antidote to the pervasive gloom, a testament to the enduring human need for lightness, even when it was officially forbidden. You could feel the subtle shift in the air when these moments occurred, a brief lifting of the heavy, gray curtain that had fallen over Rome. To truly understand Emperor Solemnus's peculiar obsession with silence and sobriety, you have to delve into the philosophical currents that shaped his mind. He wasn't simply a curmudgeon, he genuinely believed in a particular way of life, one deeply rooted in the principles of Stoicism. You can picture him in his private chambers, not laughing, but perhaps poring over the writings of Seneca or Epictetus, his brow furrowed in deep contemplation. For a Stoic, true happiness and virtue come from living in accordance with reason and nature, accepting what cannot be changed, and controlling one's own emotions. And for our emperor, laughter, with its spontaneity and often unthinking nature, likely seemed to undermine this very ideal. He saw the world as a place of serious challenges and duties, where emotional displays were a distraction from the rational pursuit of virtue. Why indulge in frivolous mirth when there were empires to govern, barbarians to deter, and the moral fabric of society to uphold? In his eyes, laughter was a superficial reaction, a fleeting pleasure that diverted attention from the profound truths of existence. It was about controlling the inner self, and for him, controlling external expressions of emotion, especially such a boisterous one, was a logical extension of that philosophy. You can almost hear him tootaying at a particularly robust laugh, seeing it as a sign of someone lacking proper self-mastery. One mainstream historical fact is that Stoicism, while promoting emotional resilience and self-control, did not universally preach the suppression of all joy. Many Stoics found contentment and even a quiet cheerfulness in their virtuous lives. However, our emperor interpreted it through a particularly rigid, almost ascetic lens, seeing any form of intense emotion as a potential weakness. He wasn't just practicing Stoicism, he was attempting to legislate it, which is where things got a bit unfun. An obscure tidbit about this era suggests that the imperial court employed a team of philosophers, or rather, interpretive scholars, whose sole job was to pore over ancient Stoic texts and selectively highlight passages that supported the emperor's anti-laughter agenda. They would present him with carefully curated excerpts, all emphasizing the dangers of excessive passion and the virtues of solemn contemplation. It was intellectual justification for an emotional aversion, creating a feedback loop that reinforced his already firm beliefs. Imagine being a philosopher tasked with finding reasons why giggling is bad. It's a career path that probably didn't attract many comedians. Historians still argue whether the emperor's severe interpretation of Stoicism was a genuine intellectual conviction, perhaps born from a personal trauma or a deeply pessimistic view of humanity, or if it was merely a convenient philosophical cloak for a ruler who was simply uncomfortable with, or even afraid of, uncontrolled joy. Was he a true believer in a grim form of self-discipline, or was his philosophy merely a rationalization for his own unsmiling disposition? Whatever the precise blend of influences, his reign became a living experiment in applied, extreme Stoicism, with the entire Roman populace as his unwitting subjects. You could practically feel the weight of philosophical expectation pressing down on every citizen, demanding an emotional restraint that most found profoundly unnatural. As the emperor's anti-laughter agenda solidified, his own imperial court transformed into a monument of gloom. You can envision the scene, the grand halls of the Roman palace, once echoing with the sounds of intrigue, ambition, and occasional revelry, now hushed and somber. Courtiers moved with a quiet purpose, their faces carefully neutral, their conversations clipped and to the point. The vibrant colors of imperial life seemed to dim under the weight of forced sobriety. It was as if every smile had been ironed flat, every chuckle surgically removed. The emperor himself became the epicenter of this joyless universe. His meals were quiet affairs, his public appearances devoid of any personal warmth. He likely viewed this as maintaining a dignified and serious demeanor befitting a ruler, but to an outside observer, it would have appeared profoundly lonely. Imagine being at a banquet where the finest delicacies are served, the most exquisite wines poured, yet the atmosphere is so stiff you could cut it with a dull butter knife. No witty banter, no shared anecdotes, just the clinking of goblets and the soft murmur of necessary conversation. It sounds less like a feast and more like a very quiet, very elaborate funeral. One mainstream historical fact about Roman courts is that they often reflected the personality of the emperor. A jovial emperor might preside over a lively court, while a paranoid one could foster an atmosphere of suspicion. In this case, Solemnus's severe disposition created a court where the absence of mirth became the ultimate sign of loyalty and decorum. To laugh, even softly, was to risk imperial displeasure, possibly even suspicion. An obscure tidbit from this period describes a palace gardener who, known for his beautiful, meticulously arranged floral displays, started incorporating plants with drooping, somber petals into his arrangements, subconsciously mirroring the prevailing mood. He even began pruning bushes into shapes that resembled frowning faces. It was a subtle, artistic rebellion, or perhaps just a man adapting his craft to the prevailing aesthetic of imperial despondency. You could walk through the imperial gardens and feel the weight of unspoken sadness emanating from the very topiary. Historians still argue whether the extreme solemnity of the court was a direct result of the emperor's explicit commands, or if it was largely a self-perpetuating phenomenon, with courtiers vying to out-solemn each other in a bizarre competition of stoicism. Did he actively demand that everyone be humorless, or did his own lack of humor simply create an environment where lightheartedness withered on its own? Whatever the precise dynamic, the end result was a court that mirrored the emperor's inner gloom, a grim tableau of power without joy. You would move through its hallowed halls feeling as though you were walking on eggshells, perpetually guarding against an accidental slip of a smile or a spontaneous burst of merriment. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. The ripple effect of the emperor's anti-laughter decree wasn't confined to the gilded cages of the imperial court, it seeped into the very fabric of daily life for every Roman citizen. You wake up in your modest insula, or perhaps your grand villa, and the first thing you notice is the pervasive quiet. The usual morning chatter of your neighbors, the playful shouts of children, the lively banter of street vendors, all are notably subdued. Life became a performance of earnestness, a constant effort to demonstrate appropriate solemnity. Public gatherings, once vibrant and noisy, were now hushed affairs. The gladiatorial games, still popular, lost some of their boisterous edge. The roar of the crowd, while still present, was tempered, as if spectators were self-consciously reminding themselves not to get too carried away with their excitement. Imagine cheering for your favorite gladiator, only to find yourself stifling a triumphant yell, replacing it with a grim nod of approval. The bread and circuses were still there, but that circuses felt a lot more like a very serious historical reenactment. One mainstream historical fact about Roman daily life is its communal nature, with much activity happening in public spaces. The emperor's ban therefore directly impacted the very way Romans interacted, forcing a cultural shift from outward expressiveness to inward restraint. It was an unprecedented social experiment. even the most private moments were not immune. An obscure tidbit recounts how Roman parents began to admonish their children not just for being loud, but specifically for giggling. Playtime became more structured, less spontaneous, with toys that made little noise preferred over boisterous games. Imagine trying to explain to a child why a funny face or a silly joke could lead to trouble. It created an underlying tension in family life, a constant awareness of the watchful eyes of society, even when those eyes were imaginary. It was like living in a perpetual silent film, where every emotional expression had to be conveyed through exaggerated, yet muted, gestures. Historians still argue whether the long-term psychological impact of this enforced solemnity led to an increase in underlying anxiety and depression among the Roman populace, or if people simply adapted to the new normal, finding internal, unexpressed ways to cope with the absence of overt joy. Did the Roman sense of humor simply go underground, waiting for its moment to re-emerge, or did it truly begin to atrophy under the weight of imperial decree? Whatever the answer, the vibrant, often boisterous soundscape of the Roman world was replaced by a strange, almost unnatural quiet, a testament to the emperor's peculiar vision of an unsmiling empire. You would feel it in your bones, this heavy silence, every day. Even a perpetually solemn emperor needs to know what's happening beyond the marble halls of Rome. So, Emperor Solemnus, true to his rigorous nature, undertook frequent travels throughout his vast empire. You can imagine him, not on a triumphant parade waving to cheering crowds, but rather moving through the provinces like a traveling storm cloud, observing, scrutinizing, and no doubt, detecting any lingering traces of unauthorized mirth. His aim was to ensure his anti-laughter edict was being uniformly enforced, from the sun-drenched shores of North Africa to the misty forests of Britannia. His journeys would have been meticulous affairs. Imagine his retinue, a solemn procession, moving through towns where the usual boisterous market cries were muted, replaced by subdued bartering and hushed greetings. He'd observe a local festival, perhaps a harvest celebration, and instead of seeing joyous dancing and communal feasting, he'd note the stiff, almost performative movements, the carefully neutral expressions on the faces of the celebrants. He wasn't looking for happiness, he was looking for compliance. You could practically hear the collective sigh of relief once his imperial entourage had passed through a town, like a pressure cooker finally releasing some steam. One mainstream historical fact about Roman emperors is that they often traveled extensively throughout their empire, partly to inspect governance, partly to project imperial power, and sometimes simply to escape the intrigues of Rome. Solemnus's travels, however, had a uniquely somber purpose. An obscure tidbit tells of his visit to a small Greek colony known for its vibrant theatrical tradition. The local governor, desperate to avoid imperial displeasure, had ordered all comedic plays to be replaced with lengthy, philosophical monologues on the transience of life. The emperor, it said, sat through a 5-hour performance, nodding approvingly at its profound lack of amusement. You can only imagine the actors, usually used to roaring applause, performing to a silent, anxious audience and an unblinking emperor. It must have been torturous for everyone involved, a true test of endurance. Historians still argue whether these imperial tours genuinely convinced the emperor that his policies were effective, or if he was simply seeing what he wanted to see, with local officials going to extraordinary lengths to present a perfectly humorless facade. Did he truly believe that the absence of public laughter signified a more virtuous populace, or was he simply insulated by layers of carefully curated solemnity, never truly witnessing the quiet acts of dissent and the simmering frustration beneath the surface? Whatever the truth, his travels solidified his conviction that his path was the correct one, reinforcing his belief that a silent empire was a strong empire. You would feel his gaze, even from afar, a heavy, unblinking assessment of your every expression. Even in the most rigid of courts, a spark of unconventional thought can sometimes ignite. Enter the court jester, a figure historically allowed a surprising degree of latitude in Roman society, often serving as a clever commentator on current events and a release valve for imperial tensions. You can imagine our emperor, Solemnus, tolerating his gesture not for amusement, but perhaps as a curious, harmless relic of a bygone, less serious era, or even as a living example of what not to be. This particular jester, however, was no ordinary fool. He was a master of subtle wit, a silent comedian in an unsmiling world, and he understood the emperor's peculiar psychology better than anyone. This jester, let's call him Rictus, a knowing wink to his forbidden craft, devised a truly audacious plan. He knew direct humor was forbidden, but what about the absence of humor, presented in such a way that it became humorous? His gambit wasn't to tell a joke, but to subtly highlight the emperor's own solemnity to him in a way that defied the ban. You'd see him perform routines that were utterly devoid of mirth, yet so painstakingly, deliberately serious that they bordered on the absurd. He would mime great tragedies with an almost robotic precision, or perform feats of juggling with an expression of such profound melancholy that it became comical in its earnestness. The goal was to make the emperor, and his court, realize the ridiculousness of their own enforced gloom, not by making them laugh, but by making them see the laughter in its absence. One mainstream historical fact about Roman jesters and fools is that they often held a unique position, sometimes acting as a conduit for public opinion or a safe outlet for criticism, precisely because their role allowed them to speak truths others dared not utter. Rictus weaponized this privilege with unprecedented subtlety. An obscure tidbit about Rictus suggests he once presented the emperor with a performance that involved him slowly, meticulously painting a portrait of a tear. The entire act lasted an hour, silent and utterly devoid of anything resembling entertainment, yet so dedicated to its own somber premise that it began to provoke a strange, almost nervous twitch in the corners of some courtiers' mouths. You could feel the tension in the air, a silent challenge, as the emperor watched, unblinking. It was like watching paint dry, but with the existential dread of being caught enjoying it. Historians still argue whether the emperor genuinely perceived Rictus's performances as artful social commentary or simply dismissed them as the peculiar eccentricities of a permitted oddity. Did Rictus's subtle defiance plant a seed of doubt in the emperor's rigid mind, or was his message utterly lost on a man so consumed by his own anti-mirth agenda? Whatever the emperor's internal reaction, Rictus's performances became a quiet beacon of resistance, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of an unsmiling empire, the spirit of wit, however suppressed, could still find a way to express itself. You'd watch him, holding your breath, wondering if this was the moment the emperor finally, just for a second, saw the joke. The emperor's relentless pursuit of a humorless society, while seemingly successful on the surface, began to trigger a cascade of unexpected and often detrimental consequences. You might have thought that suppressing laughter would lead to a more productive, more disciplined populace, but reality, as it often does, had other plans. Instead of fostering greater civic duty, the ban on mirth led to widespread disengagement and a quiet, simmering resentment. People weren't necessarily rebellious, but they certainly weren't enthusiastic. One major fallout was on public morale. Imagine living in a city where genuine joy is forbidden. The atmosphere would become heavy, oppressive. Festivals, once vital for social cohesion and the release of everyday tensions, became hollow rituals, observed out of obligation rather than genuine celebration. This led to a decline in civic participation, as citizens saw little incentive to invest their emotional energy in a society that offered no outlet for shared happiness. You'd see fewer volunteers for public works, less enthusiasm for military recruitment, and a general air of listlessness pervading the populace. It was like trying to run a marathon while wearing a weighted vest of perpetual gloom. One mainstream historical fact is that social controls, when taken to extremes, often produce unintended negative consequences, ranging from economic stagnation to social unrest. The emperor's laughter ban proved to be a textbook example of this phenomenon. Economically, the impact was also subtle but significant. The entertainment industry, which included not just gladiatorial games but also comedic plays, mimes, and public storytellers, suffered immensely. Artists, unable to ply their trade, either found new, less expressive professions or simply fell into poverty. Think of the street food vendors who relied on the lively chatter and good spirits of their customers. Now, sales might be down because everyone is too anxious to truly enjoy their panis vocatus. Trade, while not halted, lost its informal, jovial negotiations, becoming purely transactional, often leading to less flexible deals. An obscure tidbit from this era mentions a significant increase in the sale of bland, unseasoned gruel, perhaps reflecting a subconscious desire for food that matched the emotional landscape. Who wants a spicy dish when your soul feels like a dry biscuit? Historians still argue whether the emperor ever truly grasped the extent of the damage his policy was inflicting. Was he so blinded by his own philosophical conviction that he failed to connect the dots between the pervasive glumness and the empire's declining vitality, or did he simply not care, prioritizing his austere vision above all else? Whatever his perception, the empire, despite its outward solemnity, was quietly withering from within. You could feel it in the air, not just the absence of laughter, but the absence of genuine energy, creativity, and the spontaneous human connection that laughter so often fosters. The silence wasn't a sign of peace, it was the sound of a slow, emotional drain. As the reign of Emperor Solemnus wore on, despite his unwavering conviction in the virtues of a mirthless existence, a profound irony began to manifest. The very policy designed to instill discipline and focus ultimately led to his profound isolation. You can picture him, sitting alone in his vast, echoing palace, surrounded by silence, a silence that was once his ideal, but which now felt increasingly hollow. The public might have conformed, his court might have adopted his grim demeanor, but in doing so, they also withdrew from him emotionally. He had created a world where genuine human connection, often forged through shared laughter and lightheartedness, was suppressed. His advisors spoke only on matters of state, devoid of any personal anecdote or warmth. His family, once perhaps a source of quiet comfort, now maintained a respectful, yet distant, formality. Imagine being the most powerful man in the world, yet utterly alone in your thoughts, with no one daring to offer a genuine smile or a comforting jest. It must have been an incredibly heavy crown to bear. The very success of his policy became his greatest burden, a self-imposed prison of solemnity. One mainstream historical fact about absolute rulers is that their isolation can often lead to a distorted perception of reality, as dissenting voices are silenced and genuine feedback becomes scarce. Solemnus, having banished joy, inadvertently banished honest connection too. An obscure tidbit, perhaps a rumor whispered by a nervous servant, suggests that in his later years, the emperor developed a peculiar habit. He would spend hours in a forgotten wing of the palace, listening to old, dusty musical instruments, not for the music itself, but for the faint, resonant echoes of past celebrations that might still linger in the wood or bronze. He was listening not for joy, but for the ghost of it, a pathetic search for what he had so rigorously purged from his present. It's a melancholic image, a powerful man haunted by the very emotion he tried to extinguish. You might wonder if he ever regretted his choices in those quiet, solitary moments. Historians still argue whether this profound isolation was a natural outcome of his personality and policies, or if it contributed to a further deepening of his anti-mirth convictions, trapping him in a vicious cycle of loneliness and rigid ideology. Did his solitude make him more resolute in his belief, or did it slowly, subtly, chip away at the edges of his conviction, leaving him an emperor with absolute power but utterly devoid of warmth? Whatever the internal struggle, the external reality was clear. The emperor who banned laughter found himself in a world where laughter was conspicuously absent, even for him. You could almost feel the chill emanating from his lonely throne. Despite the deepening isolation and the pervasive gloom, there were, in the very late stages of Emperor Solemnus's reign, faint stirrings of something resembling a shift. Not a dramatic reversal, mind you, but a quiet loosening, a subtle crack in the monolithic wall of his enforced solemnity. You see it in fleeting moments, almost imperceptible. Perhaps a particularly severe prefect is quietly retired, replaced by someone slightly less rigid. Or a new edict is issued, surprisingly, about the importance of public festivals for civic unity, carefully omitting any mention of suppressed mirth. It was a glimmer of change, however faint, a whisper of a suggestion that perhaps, just perhaps, the unsmiling emperor might be having second thoughts, or at least, sensing the limits of his draconian policies. This wasn't a sudden epiphany, no dramatic moment where he burst into laughter. Rather, it was likely a slow, creeping realization born from the very consequences of his rule. The empire wasn't flourishing in its grim silence, it was stagnating. The lack of genuine enthusiasm, the silent disengagement you felt in the streets, would have eventually become too obvious even for an emperor so set in his ways. Perhaps a report on declining tax revenues, or a particularly concerning military recruitment shortfall, finally pierced the veil of his rigid ideology. It's hard to laugh when your treasury is empty, but it's even harder to fight a war with a perpetually dejected army. One mainstream historical fact is that even the most autocratic rulers often temper their policies when faced with undeniable evidence of their detrimental effects on the state. Survival of the empire, and their legacy, usually trump even the most cherished personal convictions. An obscure tidbit from this period recounts a story of the emperor observing children playing in a secluded courtyard within the palace. He saw a small child stumble and, instinctively, another child burst into a quiet, stifled giggle before quickly covering their mouth and looking around nervously. The emperor, for the first time in perhaps decades, did not frown. Instead, a peculiar, almost pained expression crossed his face. He simply turned and walked away, not in anger, but in what seemed to be a moment of quiet reflection. It was a subtle, human reaction to a perfectly natural moment, perhaps a tiny crack in his emotional armor. You might wonder if that fleeting giggle reminded him of a forgotten childhood joy, a memory he had long suppressed. Historians still argue whether this quiet shift was a true change of heart, a recognition of his error, or merely a pragmatic adjustment to maintain stability in an increasingly joyless empire. Did he genuinely begin to understand the human need for mirth, or was it simply a tactical retreat, a recognition that the ban was unsustainable? Whatever the motivation, these small alterations, these tiny concessions to human nature, suggested that even the most unyielding of wills could bend, however slightly, under the immense weight of reality. You could almost feel a tiny breath of fresh air, a hint of something lighter, stirring in the heavy atmosphere of Rome. The reign of Emperor Solemnus, the unsmiling ruler who tried to ban laughter, eventually drew to a close. His legacy, however, continues to echo through the corridors of history, a strange testament to the power of a single man's convictions, and the resilience of human nature. You reflect on his time on the throne, not as a period of great battles or grand conquests, but as a peculiar social experiment, a grand, empire-wide attempt to redefine happiness itself. He left behind a realm fundamentally altered by his rigid pursuit of solemnity, a society that had learned to smile internally, to find mirth in whispers and knowing glances. His impact was undeniably profound, though perhaps not in the way he intended. While he succeeded in dampening outward expressions of joy, he inadvertently solidified the human capacity for internal resistance, for finding pockets of lightness even in the deepest shadows. The city that once boomed with life, then hushed into an unnerving silence, eventually found its voice again, perhaps a little wiser, a little more appreciative of the simple sound of a genuine chuckle. One mainstream historical fact about Roman emperors is that their reigns, no matter how singular, always leave a lasting imprint on the social and cultural fabric of the empire. Solemnus's reign, while not marked by monumental architecture, left an indelible mark on the Roman psyche. An obscure tidbit that circulated after his death suggests that among his personal effects, a small, worn scroll was found. It contained not philosophical treatises or military strategies, but a collection of very old, very bad jokes, scribbled in a hand that was remarkably similar to his own. Whether they were jokes he had tried to understand, jokes he had tried to suppress, or even jokes he had, in the deepest solitude, found some grim amusement in, remains a mystery. It's a poignant image, a final, silent whisper of the humanity beneath the rigid exterior. You can almost see him, in the dead of night, secretly trying to crack a smile at a truly terrible pun. Historians still argue whether Emperor Solemnus should be remembered as a tyrannical eccentric, a misguided philosopher-king, or simply a deeply troubled individual who projected his own lack of joy onto the world. Was his reign a cautionary tale about the dangers of extreme control, or a unique chapter in the long story of humanity's endless quest for order, however grim? Whatever the final verdict, his name remains synonymous with the peculiar ambition of trying to legislate human emotion, a folly that ultimately proved futile. His legacy is not in the silence he imposed, but in the echoes of laughter that inevitably followed, a testament to the fact that you can bury joy, but you can't kill it. Now, as the echoes of Rome's unsmiling emperor fade into the quiet of the night, allow your own thoughts to drift. The weight of ancient decrees and peculiar histories can lift from your mind, replaced by a gentle sense of peace. The sounds of history, the quiet whispers of forgotten eras, are now receding, leaving you in a calm, still space. Feel the warmth of your blanket, the softness of your pillow. Let your breathing deepen, each breath a gentle wave washing over you. The empire of sleep awaits, a realm where smiles are freely given, and laughter, whether whispered or boisterous, is always welcome. There are no decorum monitors here, only the soft embrace of slumber. Drift away, knowing that even in the most serious of times, humanity always finds a way to chuckle.